Okay. So yeah, this morning we're going to be talking about the midterm and the mini mural briefly. And I want to thank you all for participating, for taking a little time on your Saturday to do this. And I hope I can clarify everything that you need to know to be able to do this successfully. So let's start with the mini mural. So this is an assignment that if you do it, you get credit, and if you don't, you don't. I'm not grading you on the quality of your artwork, originality, technique, none of that. Just that you did it. So the idea of the mini mural is to put yourself in the shoes of an artist. Here you are, you're an artist, and you're facing a blank canvas or a blank wall. And how do you express an idea through images? So I want you to experience this firsthand. So collage is fine, Photoshop is fine, crayon drawing, pencil drawing, and anything that you want to do is fine. And you'll find that in that process, you'll get to understand a little bit of what artists go through, of how do you express an idea and how do you pass it on to others in a clear way. The benefit here is you can also add a commentary that explains it, which artists can do when they're presenting it publicly. So a lot of people curse me about this, like, oh, this is so hard, I don't know how to draw. But they'll find by using a pair of scissors and cutting out pictures from magazines or cutting and pasting from the internet, they can express these ideas. And it's kind of an outlet in order to express how you feel, you have to figure out how you feel. You have to figure out like what's important, what's pressing, what are the issues, and how is it made up? How are these things represented? So kind of in that process, you're also examining your own feelings, your own state of mind. So is that clear? Anybody have any questions about that? No? Everyone's clear? Somebody say yes. Yes? I can't see you nodding your head, so just somebody type yes or say yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. All right. Yeah, the problem with these video conferences is I'm used to some interaction, so if you don't say anything, it's hard for me to know that you heard me. So you could say, yes or amen or something like that, just to give me a little feedback. Okay, so on to the midterm. So mini mural is clear. So you can post it in two places. You can post it, you should post it to be graded. And if you want to share it with others, then you can post it in the discussion, and then people can look at each other's murals. And sometimes this is helpful because you'll think, oh, mine is so bad, I'm such a loser. And then you'll look at other people's and you go, oh, wait a minute. Everyone else did pretty much the same thing or something similar. Or you'll get ideas, and also you'll get an idea of the state of mind of some of your fellow students, something that you don't always get to know. So anyway, enough about that. Okay, on to the midterm. So write essay answers. You'll need at least 2 or 3 paragraphs each, maybe more for each question based on the readings and text. No citations necessary. Please give examples and do not give vague answers. Provide details to back up your arguments. So is that clear? Anybody have any questions about that? Okay. Now, if you write more, that's fine. It just means more reading for us, but that's okay. Some people need more space to kind of unwind their ideas, and these are pretty complex questions, so it's not a problem. How are Mexican muralists now notice I'm saying muralists here, okay? How were Mexican muralists influenced by the 1910 revolution and other uprisings, and what were the objectives of the early mural movement in Mexico? So we're talking about muralists. Now, not all the artists were muralists. Can we think of any prominent artist that was not a muralist? who many people mention? Anyone think of a
Frida
prominent?
Kahlo.
Okay, Frida Kahlo. That would be an obvious one. And we're not denying her, but she is in a question that's lower down. And murals were public art, were public displays, were very controversial in many ways, and were these commissioned murals on public buildings were the face of the Mexican government, which is interesting that the government would allow and encourage this, right? I don't think they expected anything else from these obviously very politically motivated artists. They wanted to give, the Mexican government wanted to give a face of a revolutionary government that reflected the values and goals of the Mexican Revolution. So, what were these? How were the Mexican muralists influenced by the 1910 revolution? Well, the revolution was a massive uprising all across the country, and the outpouring of resentment over hundreds of years of colonialism, and then the neo-colonialist regime that forms later, the loss of much of Mexican territory in the mid 19th century, where much of what's now the Southwest is the United States is taken from Mexico. All of these things begin to build up. Again, the concentration of land in fewer and fewer hands that Porfirio Diaz oversees. Again, the re-stratification of Mexico by creating these large, allowing the consolidation of industrial agriculture, and many small farmers are displaced. People go from being small farmers to becoming peons or sharecroppers, virtual debt slaves. So the Mexican Revolution had a profound effect in freeing people from the plantation economy, from the hacienda. Also at this time, this massive uprising reflected the resentment of many groups. Again, small landowners, small business owners, regional interest groups, people in Yucatan, in Oaxaca, and other parts of Mexico with different agendas. Some very narrow nationalist agendas, some with broader agendas. We saw agrarian revolutionaries, anarcho-syndicalists, and anarchists in the North who were proposing a more egalitarian society without leaders, without the corruption of leaders. Emiliano Zapata, an agrarian revolutionary from Morelos, seeking to go back to more of the indigenous forms of government. We see very little influence of Marxism in the 1910 revolution because there was no Communist Party in Mexico, and there was few ways for people to even know about Marxism or to learn about it. So although some of these revolutionaries had been influenced, and even the anarchists, many of them embraced some of Marx's ideas, but they embraced them in very different ways than what Marx proposed and what came out of the Communist Party later. So the 1910 revolution, land, bread, equality, freedom, these were some of the things that were proposed by the revolutionaries. And many of these were embedded in the 1917 Constitution. The 1917 Constitution of Mexico was the culmination of many of the demands, which included educational reform, dedicating a certain amount of the government budget to education, land reform, constitutional reforms that would guarantee civil rights, voting rights, things like this, which really opened up Mexican society in many ways by allowing citizens to have a much stronger voice. Now, so the 1910 revolution had a huge impact, and we can see many of these things in many of the murals, again, especially land reform, the civil rights, again, women having a new place in society, and workers being recognized for the first time. So what other uprisings were they influenced by? Well, we could see the Russian Revolution of 1917 was obviously an important one. And going back to the Constitution, probably one of the most important is Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution that legalizes the creation of ejidos, or communal land holdings that allow for communities to collectively hold land. This means that it's like a cooperative where people are owners in the sense that while they're part of the community, if they move away, they lose their holdings. So this is a way of keeping communities together. And this was seen as a strategic move on the part of the government to avoid starvation. That by creating these ejidos, these collective land holdings, it guaranteed that there were going to be people growing rice, beans, and squash, and corn, the essential foods, the holy trinity of corn, beans, and squash, la milpa, had been traditionally grown, and the idea was that on these collective lands, this would be a hedge against the possible starvation that they thought might occur after the revolution, again, as there was a breakdown in the distribution and during the farming during the war. So the ejido system is also emblemized in many of the murals. You'll see the land reform, and again, people sitting around at a table and groupings and the coming together of farmers and workers. Again, the ejido system creates also a consciousness of the cultural implications of farming also, and how people are tied to the land and how they administer the land. The ejido system usually went back to earlier forms of organization, that the leaders of the ejidos would be the elders of the community, and the idea was to preserve Mexican culture through this also. So we see the influence of the 1917 revolution in Russia, the forming of the Soviet Union, and this had a huge influence also, because the 1917 revolution, very similar to the 1910 revolution in Mexico, was a massive uprising in the same way of many different groups. But in this case, the Bolsheviks, a Marxist party led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, was able to seize power. The Bolsheviks proposing to all these different groups that meet, and you can see in the book 10 Days That Shook the World, John Reed talks about these climatic events where people get together and decide, well, where is this going? How are we going to address the problems of the past? How do we wipe out the inequality and all the issues that we faced in the past? And Lenin proposes a Marxist-based society, a socialist society, a socialism which Marx sees as a path on the way to communism, a temporary solution between capitalism and communism. And in this period, we see a lot of discussion going on as the Soviet Union is being formed about how this is going to be implemented and how these Marxist ideas are going to be translated into a government program. So this is what goes on. So these are discussions that are going on in the Soviet Union and going on all over the world as people are deciding, how do we, now that we've vanquished capitalism in this place, how do we create a more equitable society? And there were discussions. Again, we're talking about a time of war right after World War I, constant attacks by other European powers. So the Soviet Union isn't able to do this in a vacuum, but in a wartime situation with aggressive opposition. So these are things that also influeed sorry, that influence the Mexican artists as these discussions are going on. So other things that you could look at the aesthetics, the influences of European art, Cubism, modernism, Mexican folk art, indigenous art. These are things that also influence the muralists. What were the objectives of the early mural movement? Well, the early mural movement is formed in the early 1920s as the government program funds and commissions muralists to paint on government buildings. And the idea is part of a public education program to create a public education system in Mexico that didn't really exist before this. Much of the schools were run by the church. And to create a public face of the government that looked like that they were representing the interests of the revolution that people had fought and died for. So the commissioning of these works under Jose Vasconcelos began, and he looks to a whole series of artists, but Los Tres Grandes become the face of it, Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco. They begin painting in the Secretaría de Educación, which is a teacher training, the Ministry of Education, which is also a teacher training center, which is important. Looking at these murals, that you can see they're also talking to the teachers or the future teachers. And these are the teachers that will also be training other teachers. And they see themselves as the vanguard of the revolution, that the revolution will, the goals of the revolution will be carried out by people throughout Mexico who are embodying and carrying with them the ideals of the revolution. So this is why these murals are so important at this time. I think many of you in your writings questioned Vasconcelos' motives, and his work, La Raza Cósmica, has been used in many ways. And if you read it, what he's proposing is that a mixed race, that racial mixture and cultural mixture, it can only produce something positive. He says that long time cultures become stagnant. Long traditions many times create a stagnant culture, and that the mixture of these will create a superior culture or ethic towards development and solving, again, the problems that are seen in society. Now, his work has been used by many people. It was used by fascist groups. Later in the 60s, it was used by the Chicano movement in the United States, and it's been interpreted in many different ways. So he got a bad rap. He warned people not to dismiss the Spanish influence. Not that he was praising it necessarily, but he was saying that you can't deny that there were some positive elements that came out of it. This is something that people have touched on. So the objectives of the mural movement, again, were to promote the ideals of the revolution, to protagonize Mexican people, the way they look, again, the aesthetics of Mexican culture, mestizo people, working people, peasants, portray events in Mexican history, because there were very few books published at this time. So this is why these murals were so important, because they couldn't just publish a new curriculum, a new school curriculum. They didn't have ways to do this at the time, and the murals provided a backdrop, kind of a public face of this public education program that was going on. Meanwhile, they're writing the textbooks and the curriculum that's going to be part of this public education. But millions of school children visited these murals and discussed the murals and used these as a point of reference to talk about Mexican history. This is something that isn't really touched upon too much in the text, and I couldn't really find anything about it. But this is one of the goals of the movement. So is this clear? Anybody have any questions? Comments? No? Onwards? Okay. All right. So that's the most complicated question, and this is the one where people go wrong because they'll leave out things. So the main things to touch on again would be the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the aesthetics that they're bringing, and what the objectives were. Can anyone think of any other objectives or any other influences? Okay. So the next question is based on the interview with Diego Rivera's daughter. And I think it's pretty clear. How did Diego Rivera view the role of an artist in society, and how is this expressed in one of his murals? So somebody asked me, well, how do you find that in one of the murals? There's no rocket science here. Diego Rivera, let's take one of the points. Can anyone think of one of the things that he mentions in this interview that might be relevant?
He said that artists are necessary, that they're like the blood in like your circulation.
Right. Okay. That's a good one. That's a really good one. And so that's an important one. Now, why are artists necessary? Could we live without art? Could we survive without art? He said art is a form of nutrition, right? Of nourishment for the imagination. Why do we need this? Could we survive without it? Or is this an exaggeration? Let's think about it. Well, art helps us to visualize other outcomes, right? To imagine other outcomes, other possibilities than what's facing us, right? So how would we find a mural that would reflect this? Could we think of one? Almost any of his murals, right? Uh, how about the flower carrier that we looked at? The man carrying a huge load of flowers on his back. Well, it causes you to think, right? It's another way of looking at flowers, right? And not just their beauty, but again, looking at how do the flowers get to us? How do the flowers get from the field to our table or to our hands? Again, looking at the role of labor in this whole process. So it's nourishment for the imagination. We have to imagine these things. And again, so any of the murals would work in this context. So this is kind of a to interpret some of the main points that he touches on. And I put this in here just so you can look, and because this is a rare moment where an artist, again, his daughter asks him, hey, Dad, some friends at the university want to know what's the role of the artist in society. And he goes on for an hour explaining it. But rarely will we see an artist doing that, explaining their work in such detail and their motivation. And he did this at the end of his life, so he's also analyzing all the things that he's learned. So I think this is a really important interview in terms of understanding Rivera and understanding the process that he was going through. So there's kind of no right and wrong answer here. It's just to look at it and try to synthesize this and then find an example. And I don't think you're not going to find a literal example, but I think you'll find also he talks about an artist representing their own views, that propaganda is okay, that to promote your own views, your own outlook, this is what an artist does. And we can see in a lot of cases where he did that, maybe against the wishes of the people that commissioned the mural. Is that clear? Any questions, doubts, comments? Okay. Let me look at the chat. So nobody's chatting here. Somebody just type yes, just to make sure that I'm getting that. Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, onwards. Describe the differences in the approach to art of the following artists. How did their artistic vision differ? So again, no right and wrong answer here. Look at each one of their art and use your own analysis to describe the differences. Now, there's no right and wrong answer, but it's just to kind of dig in, and it forces you to look at art, to create your own criteria for looking at art. How do you distinguish the differences between what they do and their approach to art, right? So I think this one, it's just a matter of giving some details, some examples, and most people get this one right, because it's just based on your own analysis. So the next one is a tricky one because we don't have too much reading about this. How did the Zapatista movement of the 1990s transform Mexican culture? So based on the film and the few readings that I put in there, I'm just asking you to give an analysis based on this, because I'm not asking you to go outside of the class, although you could, but I think everything you need is there, especially in the film The Sixth Sun, Mayan Uprising in Chiapas. So in this film, it was done by my father, Saul Landau, and the voice of the interviewer in many of the interviews is me. I was there conducting the interviews. And what you see here is the impact of the Zapatista movement on Mexican culture. As the Zapatista uprising occurs in 1994, where indigenous people take up weapons and begin rising up against the government, why doesn't the government just wipe them out as they have in the past? Well, we see massive outpourings of support all through the country. People holding hands, ringing them and protecting them with their bodies against the government. And we can see that people all over Mexico begin to realize the power of the indigenous people and even the presence of indigenous people in Mexico. Many people in Mexico were even oblivious or were not aware of the continuance of many of the indigenous cultures, especially the Mayan culture. We hear about the extinction of the Maya or the disappearance of the Maya as the Mayan traditional ceremonial cities and temples are abandoned. Mayan people create smaller communities. And people are surprised to see that there's millions of people in Mexico who still practice the Mayan culture and still identify themselves as a part of it. And we can see also the transformation of Mayan culture that you can see in the videos as women take a new role and kind of a transformation that goes on. So how did the Zapatista movement of the 1990s transform Mexican culture? Well, we can see this in the film, that it creates an awareness of the indigenous culture and showing the possibilities of other paths to development, right? So we can see it, those of you that have traveled to Mexico can see this. We can see a new recognition, a new place for indigenous culture in Mexico, as even in parts of Mexico, people begin to hyphenate their identity. People call themselves Maya Mexicano, or they begin to hyphenate as we do Italian American, African American. People begin to hyphenate their Mexican identity, Zapoteco Mexicano, etc. Because we see a new awareness. We see language schools appearing all through Mexico, people sending their children to learn the indigenous languages and to value and to respect these cultures that had been seen by many as relics of the past. So is this clear? Anybody have any questions about this question? Yes, clear. Okay, thank you. So I think the film and the readings, the Declaration of the Lacandon Jungle, describes pretty much what their objectives were, and the film shows what the impact was. How was women's representation and participation transformed in the 1920s and 1930s in Mexico? Um, I should have made this clear in art. I'll amend that. um, so in the section that I put about women artists, it talks about the participation of women artists and the representation of women in the art. Right? We can see that women. We can see working women, peasant women, especially las Tehuanas, the women of Tehuantepec of southern Oaxaca, represented as a dominant force in Mexico. Now, Tehuantepec, southern Oaxaca, is a region of Mexico that was dominated by a matriarchal system, which is why they're represented so much in these murals. Vasconcelos realized because Mexico, before the revolution, it was very difficult to travel around because there were poor road system. It was very dangerous. There were bandits and police checkpoints and things like this that made it very difficult for people to travel from one area to another. And so he realized that many of the artists trying to paint Mexico only knew they were city slickers, or they didn't really know the rural parts of Mexico or some of the far-flung areas, and especially southern Oaxaca. So he sent them to Tehuantepec to view the beautiful ceremonies, the aesthetics, the beautiful art, and the way the matriarchal system worked in southern Oaxaca. And if you're interested in learning about this, there's a lot of things to read about it. And I'll post a video called Viva Mexico that was made in 1932 that was done by a Russian, Sergei Eisenstein, and later finished in the 1960s with the participation of Frida Kahlo, Rivera Siqueiros, and others who helped in the making of it. And they do a short sort of documentary narrative about the matriarchal culture in Oaxaca. So we can see the transformation as women, to a very small extent, begin to participate as artists. And we looked at some of those, Aurora Reyes and Maria Izquierdo and others, and Frida Kahlo, and what their role was. Again, they were many times marginalized by the men who didn't really encourage too many women to participate in the murals or give them much encouragement. And we can see also even Frida Kahlo, whose work was so important, wasn't really recognized in Mexico until long after her death. She only had one show in Mexico, which was at a small gallery close to her at the time of her death. And so that her work wasn't publicly displayed in Mexico, even though she was seen by kind of the in-group of artists, mainly because she was Rivera's wife. And most of her sales of art were outside the country. And she was recognized by the art elite in New York and Paris and other places. But at this time, there were no coffee table books and no internet. And so people had no way of seeing her art until long after her death. So is this clear? Anything else? Any comments? Okay. All right, onwards. Okay, describe the topic of your research paper and explain how the topic is relevant to the material presented in this class. I don't know yet is not a valid answer. This is not for credit, it's just a reference to give you feedback about your topic. So the idea here is just to say what your topic is. Now, what could a topic be? Well, anything we talk about in the class, and even things that are related in some way. So people ask, well, what about graffiti artists? Good topic. How do you relate it to what we're talking about? Well, many of the graffiti artists are dealing with the same issues that the Mexican muralists here. The graffiti art is public art. Do the graffiti artists have a social responsibility? What are they representing? Who are they representing? Why are they doing this at all. So these are things you can look at. How about rappers? Okay, make your case. How about modern dancers? How about the Black Panther? So if you can make your case, if you can explain how it's relevant to the material presented in the class, then that's fine. So what I'm asking you to do is find something that you're passionate about, something that's piqued your interest in the class, something that you maybe already interested in and want to talk about. An interesting one would be to look at the representation of Frida Kahlo and Frida Mania and how she's become such an icon. Maybe the role of Madonna in promoting the work of Frida Kahlo. And anyway, any number of instances. People have looked at the mission mural movement, the Chicano art movement, Puerto Rican art, the cultural brigades in Chile, other Latin American artists like Guayasamín and others that could be relevant. So, any questions about this? So this one won't be graded. This will just be a.
I have a question about that one.
Yeah.
So, when we describe the topic of the research paper, does it also have to be the 2 to 3 paragraphs?
No. I mean, you just put this is for you, not for me. So what you're doing is putting out, it's a way to put out your topic, to explain your topic, define your topic, and commit. And it's just, and then I could give you some feedback or some sources. Because I've read hundreds and thousands of research papers like these, and I could say, well, maybe you're writing about Frida Kahlo. Well, don't leave out, look at Hayden Herrera's biography of Frida Kahlo. That if you don't do this, you're going to miss out on a lot, because this is the main reference that people use, because she was the one that had access to primary sources, right?
So, and after we turn this in, are we allowed to like tweak our topic a little?
Oh yeah, you could abandon your topic altogether. Yeah, you're not committing to doing what you say you're going to do, but you're committing to at least document or describing what you're trying to do. Sometimes you'll start down a path and you realize that it's not what you're interested, or it's too hard, so you'll switch. That's fine. And you can write to me, and if you have some kind of existential dilemma along the way, you can write to me and ask me. It's pretty easy to get lost here, but I think there's a lot of stuff. I don't know where all of you are, but you can even find primary sources. You can find people who are doing this art, who are influenced by this all around you, all around California, especially if you're in the Bay Area or in Santa Cruz or San Jose. There's a lot of Latino artists who are active, who are highly influenced by the Mexican mural movement and the other revolutionary art movements that we're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about Cuba and Nicaragua, and these are things that are going on. A lot of people are influenced by these. So you can kind of look at the dilemma of the artist. Again, is art just for art's sake, or do artists have a social responsibility? And this is a question that every artist has to ask themselves, and it's kind of a dilemma, right, that each one of them faced. That how do I express my own feelings, but also make some kind of political statement, right? So is this clear? Anybody? Questions, comments? Okay. Well, I'm very grateful for you for taking this time, and again for all the work that you've done. I'm pretty amazed at the quality of the work that's coming in, and your dedication for doing this in the summer instead of going out surfing and being at the beach. You're here typing away on the keyboard, or maybe you're doing it at the beach. That's fine. So. If you have nothing else, I'm sitting here grading papers and trying to heal. And I'll look forward to reading this soon. So any problem that you have, just write to me. I can't make the deadline. I need an extension. That's all you need to tell me. I don't need to hear the whole story. I understand life is complicated, and I want to work with you. So try to meet the deadlines if you can, and if you can't, let me know. That shows me that you're on track, that you're doing it, and you're also making a commitment to do it, to get it done. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the recording right now and say goodbye. So again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know how valuable Saturday mornings are, and to give up 40 minutes is a big sacrifice, and I appreciate it. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.